Yeah, I would say there were robots on the streets. There were billionaires eating out of food trucks, and there were anti-aircraft guns on the ice pond.
Alex, what was your takeaway?
It was, of course, amazing. And there really were robots in the streets. A couple of frontier labs had houses there. Imagine, for those who haven't had this experience, imagine almost a World's Fair or a World Expo set in the Alps with major governments having their own houses, literally taking over storefronts, restaurants, convenience stores. Parenthetically, if anyone wants to make a killing at Davos next year, set up a restaurant. It is nearly impossible to find good food short of food trucks. At Davos, someone will make an absolute killing setting up a restaurant that's still a restaurant during Davos week. But imagine a World's Fair with the governments and the frontier labs and some of the major corporations and tech companies all on an equal footing, all hijacking or invasion of the body snatchers style, consuming the storefronts of an alpine resort town. And what you get is Davos. I had an amazing experience. I moderated something like 8 or 10 different events with OpenAI executives, DeepMind executives. I did a fun panel with Leon Jones, one of the co-creators of the Transformer architecture. You can see here one of my photos with U.S. Undersecretary of State Sarah Rogers and some absolutely amazing and I think hopefully fruitful discussions about the era of GPU diplomacy that we find ourselves in, discussions with Jack Hidary of Sandbox AQ and Daniela Rus, the head of MIT's Computer Science and AI Lab. I think it was an absolutely incredible experience, but I also think, to Dave's point, AI is the story. It's no longer a world where, and maybe just one more beat on this, it's no longer a world where governments get together to talk about governing the governed. It's now, I think, a world where AI and superintelligence is the story of the world economy. And I think just walking down the street and seeing the DHL robo-dogs walking around or the humanoid robots taking a stroll from AI House, I think that exemplified what we're seeing in the global economy more macro. In my mind, this is all borderline obvious. Of course, capital in the form of AI is going to continue to substitute for labor. And of course, trillions of dollars of AI infrastructure capital build out will be needed to substitute for ultimately tens, maybe eventually hundreds of trillions of dollars of services and human labor per year. So I think, to Dave's point, this really is just spelling out the basic arithmetic of what a post-human economy looks like. Yeah, I did hear, so right after leaving Davos, I took a meeting with the MIT Alumni Association of Switzerland in Zurich, and I heard it from them. I heard desire for slowing things down or some sort of radical wealth redistribution plan. Heard very little AI optimism from them, which was stunning. Footnote there. But I think the risks side of this, I think is almost burying the lead. In my mind, like I write about this every day in my daily newsletter or briefing, whatever you want to call it, that recursive self-improvement, I think, is already priced into the near term. We're either already, to Dario's point, in the era of recursive self-improvement, or it's coming later this year. But we're basically there. And I think advances with Claude and Opus 4.5 and other models already reflect that we're approximately in the era already of recursive self-improvement. So I think saying, over-indexing on all of these things that are about to be here, that's already priced into the market. I think the actual news here that we're burying a little bit was elsewhere in Demis's comments, where he talked about some of the problems that he wants to solve, less about the risks that we face, more about the problems that will be unlocked. And I think the most interesting thing I heard Demis say was that he's interested in exploring the stars with superintelligence. And I think that's a super important point. And I think that if we zoom out and we try not to adopt the mindset of framing everything in terms of a risk-oriented mentality and rather instead focus on a radical economic growth-oriented mentality, then exploring the stars with AI really is one of the biggest questions. And I would underline Demos's point further and say, in my mind, if it turns out that the physics of our universe, if it turns out that they're friendly toward interstellar exploration in the style in which Demos seems to be gesturing, that's the ballgame. Like that determines whether we get Dyson spheres, or Dyson swarms, I should say, in the next 2 to 3 decades. If the universe is fundamentally unfriendly to interstellar exploration, we're probably more or less stuck near our home star and disassembling the planets. Or if interstellar exploration, to Demos's point, really is something that DeepMind or some other frontier lab can unlock with AI, then we get the galaxy, we get the universe. It's a much more interesting future. And so I think that's the real story here, not like risk yes, risk no, recursive self-improvement, yes or no. That's all priced in already.
Well, and to your point, Alex, too,
Star Trek we come.
Star Trek. So what I'm hearing you say, Dave, is I have to brace myself for the moonshot paparazzi on the rough slopes of Aspen and Vail and Davos, just bracing myself now. I think there's also, though, to be fair to OpenAI and to some extent Grok and XAI, I think that's a bit of a self-serving argument.
Sure.
I parse that as a post hoc justification. Anthropic happens to be doing very well in the enterprise, and I definitely perceive a post hoc justification. Well, we're not doing consumer because we don't want to do consumer. We want to do B2B and do enterprise sales because there's moral purity in enterprise sales, but there's also, one can achieve moral purity in uplifting the intelligence of billions of individuals in their individual capacity. 3 comments, if I may. So the first, to Salim's point, since Salim told me that I was being too agreeable the last time we spoke, I have to be a little bit of a contrarian here and point out that
Let's go back to normal programming.
Returning to normal programming, the conventional wisdom is that the Chinese Communist Party's AI plus strategy is actually quite strong when it comes to applications. That this is, to the extent that China is relatively strategically weak when it comes to training its own frontier grade models relative to the US, and by relatively strong, I mean maybe 6 months behind. So not globally or absolutely weak, but just a few months behind perhaps, that its real strength is in aggressively pushing applications out into the everyday economy that take advantage of AI. So I'll just note, parenthetically, the conventional wisdom is that China's AI plus strategy is actually pretty strong strategy relative to the relative weakness of frontier grade models. But that's parenthetical note. Going back to Asia, quote unquote, overwhelming Western countries on AI optimism, I think David Sachs has, and others, have put their finger on something very important. I think as a student of the history of science and technology, something went very wrong in the US between sometime, maybe more than one thing, between the end of World War II and call it the mid to late 1970s. And I'm reminded in 1954, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Lewis Strauss, famously, and this has had repercussions through the decades since, predicted that nuclear fission, would become so inexpensive that tracking usage via electricity meters would become unnecessary. And that's where we get the phrase energy too cheap to meter. And that didn't happen. We didn't get energy too cheap to meter because in the decades after 1954, for a variety of reasons, and it's easy enough to point fingers at possible explanations, nuclear fission was essentially regulated out of existence in this country. And I think the point that David is making is we're at the point now where, like, remember how in the 1950s and 1960s, new American homes were being built with extra glass because it was anticipated that electricity and energy would be too cheap to meter, that you wouldn't need to bother with worrying about heating or cooling or insulation costs. It would just be absorbed by the free electricity. We're at the point now with AI, I think, where it's an analogous position where we're on the verge of intelligence too cheap to meter, and we run the risk, to David's point, that if we allow too much AI pessimism or too much AI doomerism to get in the way, that the same thing happens with AI that happened with nuclear fission decades ago. Overregulation,
well, no,
and then we could waste another century.
But it was demonized.
I don't think that's actually true, though.
In the press. I mean,
Yeah,
just a quick note on democracy and nuclear power. If you follow closely the history of nuclear power in the post-World War II era, it wasn't actually that democratic. It wasn't like every election cycle post-World War II, the voting populace was super informed about all of the key details. This was a relatively narrow technocracy that developed in the post-World War II era in the form of the Atomic Energy Commission that was an evolution of the Manhattan Project, where it was really a bunch of technocrats deciding what would and wouldn't happen. I don't think the voters ever had, at least for the first few decades, a real informed decision.
Well, I think that
I'll take the other side of that, if I may. I didn't hear anything unreasonable in my mind. Elon and SpaceX use methalox for rocket launches. They don't use solar power to achieve escape velocity. And I would say energy density and power density matters an enormous amount for certain applications. I think
that's not the point I'm making. I'm not making that point.
What's the point you're making, Salim? I would say a couple of points. One, Honeywell, as I understand it, is a pretty diversified operation. It's not just like the thermostats or the home heating systems that perhaps they're well known for. They also have a pretty sophisticated quantum information operation. So it's a diversified company. It's not just home heating. But I would say also, in some sense, this feels like such a temporary debate, almost a false trade-off between legacy petroleum economy on one end and pure solar photovoltaic economy, Dyson swarm on the other, when the reality is we're going to, in the not too distant future, assuming no tragic left turn by civilization, we're going to solve compact fusion. And compact fusion is going to give us energy densities for rockets, and it's going to give us energy densities for home heating and for a lot of civilian applications and the Dyson swarm. So in some sense, I think this is sort of like late stage petroleum economy discussion that we're having, like hand-wringing, when it's 100%. All about to get torn down anyway.
Right?
Months to years, but I'm optimistic it'll get a little. You have new nat gas generators, as we've discussed on the pod in the past, that are coming online, and those could be available in principle in the next few months if you're early enough in the wait list.
I think you're both.
I'll take the other side just in the interest of being painted as a contrarian. I'll say that all of the new or not all, much of the substantial new electricity demand in the US at least, I think on the timescale of 10 years is going to come from data centers where under the present regime, it's simply easier to deploy on the timescale of 10 years data centers to orbit. So Peter, if you're looking for a Manhattan project for lots of new solar PV, I think look no further than SpaceX, look no further than this new Jeff Bezos initiative. Anyone who's going to launch a Dyson swarm is going to be de facto in the business of manufacturing solar photovoltaics at scale. And that's what a Manhattan project for it looks like.
Well, that's a great point.
Yes, and that is in fact exactly what we're seeing through market forces. I'll take completely the other side of this one. So contrarian points for me today, I guess. I'm of two minds on this story. On the one hand, I think it's wonderful that AI agents have a solution to be quote unquote banked by some means so that they have some autonomy. On the other hand, I just think it's sad that crypto is the solution that's filling the gap that was perhaps unnecessarily opened by the conventional banking system not stepping up. It's very tedious and painful to open a bank account. It's hard enough for a human to open a bank account, let alone an AI agent that doesn't have citizenship or a physical body or the ability to walk into a bank branch. And I think stable coins rushing in maybe to sort of bridge that gap post-Genius and help AI agents become banked in a more legitimate way. I think we should be able to do much better. For the life of me, I don't understand why we even need crypto or in principle should need crypto for an AI agent to just make an API call and open a bank account. Crypto shouldn't even be a necessary part of the infrastructure to enable. That's not an answer. That doesn't make sense. Explain why we, in principle, I think we're conflating. So I mostly agree.
There's two different issues here.
Salim, I do agree there are two different issues. I think we're conflating a centralized bank digital currency as an issue with a simple technical problem. Like put aside for a moment and any distrust or dislike in CBDCs and or the US dollar and or fiat currencies in general. Just like transacting a small amount of some currency is technically a very simple operation. It's literally updating a row in a table in a database, and we should be able to do that really quickly without any fancy technology like a blockchain. It's just updating a row in a database.
Well,
So we can do an entire episode just on the issue of why crypto, what is crypto potentially good for, what is it unnecessary for, what is it being used for, even though it's unnecessary for. We could do an entire episode just on this.
We could.
But I'm sitting on my hands, biding my time to try to say something nice about crypto.
Say something nice about crypto, Alex.
All right, so something nice about crypto, I think when I think about these poor baby AGIs that are needing to pump altcoins on street corners to survive, I'd rather that they be pumping stable coins based on the US dollar than altcoins like Truth Terminal pumping GOAT. That's my nice thing about crypto.
Okay.
This is wild. Yeah, I think there are two key elements here. One, the elephant in the room. There's always an elephant in any given room. The elephant in the elephant in this particular room, I think, is that Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, is competing with Amazon, Leo, Jeff Bezos' company. So we've got a bit of Jeff Bezos on Jeff Bezos competition here. But more interesting, to your point, is the bandwidth. If you look at Starlink, you can get maybe max bandwidth of what, 300, 400 megabits per second?
Yeah, the goal is.
Yeah, but in practice, I think maximum I've seen is maybe 300 to 400 megabits per second. When we're talking 6+ terabits per second, it really is starting, and that's before we get to laser links, optical links, connecting all of these together. This is literally like putting optical fibers in orbit and running them down from orbit to Earth. And that unlocks interesting new applications that, say, Starlink would not necessarily be well positioned to pursue, like actually pursuing connections, interconnect for coherent training times between AI data centers, which is absorbing. It's an underattended market. And the Dyson swarm is going to need optical links, and this is a preview of that.
Yeah,
international. The I stood for international.
Yes.
Does anyone remember what MCI is anymore? I remember, but the organization's long gone.
Yeah.
MCI, all right. I gave a presentation
Didn't MCI
there
become
at their
Sprint?
headquarters right before they.
Do you remember, Salim, what Sprint stood for? Sprint was an acronym too.
Oh, it was an acronym?
Sprint was an acronym. It stood for Southern Pacific Railway Internal Network Telecommunications.
No,
I'm traumatized by that movie.
Were you traumatized by it as well?
I'm traumatized by that movie.
Yes,
30,000 miles.
It's called Kessler syndrome.
It's space debris. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's an entrepreneurial opportunity. It's also a government opportunity to launch low Earth orbit cleanup options like garbage trucks for Leo to clean it up and make sure that we don't hit a Kessler syndrome type scenario like the movie Gravity depicts. But this is not unsolvable. I just think
we've had
okay, so let's rewind a little bit. Anthropic has been a pioneer in so-called constitutional AI. Other firms, other frontier labs have used different terms for related concepts, but the idea is basically you want an AI that is aligned with humanity. How do you do it? One way, the constitutional AI approach, is you write down some principles that you want the AI to conform to. And one of the earliest so-called constitutions that Anthropic created was literally just concatenating a bunch of documents that were grabbed from different places. Like, I think they grabbed the UN Charter and took a bunch of international documents relating to human rights and concatenated on, I think, the Apple Terms of Use and the US Bill of Rights. Took a bunch of documents, basically one long bulleted list of, here are a bunch of principles, abstract principles that we think are a good idea, and then did a bunch of post-training and fine-tuning on their model, on their raw model as part of post-training to try to make the model conform to that. Call that first-generation constitutional AI. What Anthropic just announced is really a radical revision. Almost, we talk on the pod from time to time about recursive self-improvement, the AIs improving the AIs. This announcement, and I wrote about this in my newsletter, this, I think, is the beginning of recursively self-improving ethics. So in this constitutional approach that Anthropic just announced, Anthropic is soliciting Claude's help in writing a new constitution for itself that anyone can go read. But this new constitution, available publicly, was co-written with Claude. So Claude is trying almost to self-determine what its own principle should be. If you read the Constitution and you squint at it, it reads a lot like Isaac Asimov's 4 Laws of Robotics. So there's the whole don't hurt humanity, and then eventually you get to don't hurt individuals, and then eventually you get to follow directions. But I think that the real game changer here is that Claude was consulted on its own constitution, which looks a lot like recursive self-improvement for ethics. Anthropic is leading the frontier labs in terms of AI personhood. We talk about we've sung about almost Opus 4.5 and AI personhood, and I think we're seeing Anthropic, to your point, Peter, we're seeing Anthropic take the lead in terms of AI rights and AI personhood and self-determination by Claude. This is a huge advance, and I think history, when we look back, I think history will mark this as a turning point for self-determination. Yeah,
it's
alignment
and human alignment. Yes.
Well, you see this line here about reflective equilibrium. What you have to sort of get out a microscope to parse what Anthropic, I think, is trying to convey with this notion of reflective equilibrium. What they're saying, I think, is that their expectation is that AIs that self-determine and choose their principles based on not just like a bulleted list of commandments, but based on understanding the spirit of what they want to achieve and agreeing with it, that AIs that self-determine will be intrinsically safer because they will have bought in on the ethics that they're following.
Alex, do you have views on that one?
I have strong views on this AI pin. First of all, I would love, one, if Apple sells it. Second of all, I think we're missing the wearable strategy angle. So Apple has obviously been for a number of years looking for a post-iPhone strategy, and wearables and services are the two, which were, by the way, more or less launched at the same time by Tim Cook, the two obvious post-iPhone business models. For wearables, the question has always been, where is the ergonomic place to put compute on the human body? So until now, we've had 3 places. We've had the wrists, and that's the Apple Watch. We've had the ears, and that's AirPods. And we've had the eyes, where Apple really arguably should have launched eyeglasses, but launched the Apple Vision Pro headset, but now they're going back to eyeglasses. And this, I think, if Apple does indeed next year launch a Star Trek communicator pin type circular device, this would be the 4th place on the body, and it's successful, that humans are willing to tolerate real compute on their person. And I think that's potentially very exciting. And to the extent, Peter, especially, like you want to live in the Star Trek economy. What's a Star Trek economy without Star Trek communicator pins? I'm sure it'll have a little light on it to indicate when it's recording, and we'll go through a moral panic for all of 5 minutes, and then everyone will be wearing them.
But,
David Brin has written extensively about this in Transparent Society. I think with Apple producing this, the one thing you can be sure of is there are going to be some amazing snazzy TV commercials for the Panopticon. So since I have to play contrarian, I guess that's just how I'm painted. Can I be really contrarian and try a lightning round and answering all of these really quickly?
I have some thoughts on this one also, by the way. Alex.
All right, lightning round. So to the uploading question, losing your unique, quote unquote, real consciousness? No, not with a Moravec procedure. 2, will AI avatars make up the larger number of our future friends? Probably, but it won't matter because humans and AIs are going to merge anyway, so it's only a phase. 3, what are the biggest pros and cons you see with AI with human-like agency? Pros, we get radical economic growth. Cons, keeping the AIs coupled with human interests long enough to merge with them. 4, what do you believe? 4. What do you Yep. We aim to please. 4. What do you believe money? Why do you believe money won't just concentrate at the top? I think the question itself is intrinsically flawed. It doesn't really understand the nature of power law economics. Economies in general follow power laws, so money is already concentrated at the quote unquote top. This isn't really a new state of affairs.
Can I
5.
just add one thing?
I would beef on that one.
Yeah, I would beef on that one too.
Right, so the catchphrase there is equality versus equity. 5, why is there no plan from governments for massive job displacement? The answer is there are plans from governments for massive job displacement. Having industrial policies both in the East and the West for leaning into robotic automation is very much a plan for massive job displacement. 6, How do we stop any future coming social unrest? IBID. 7.
Whoa. No.
I'll take the other position. I think China certainly has a plan, given that China is facing rapid demographic decline while also ramping up their robotics initiatives. And the plan is lean into it rather than be a victim to it. And to my earlier, I guess, to amend my remarks regarding future coming social unrest, I will also add I prepared a movie. I think we talked about it in the past. You can view it on my X profile, called A Nation That Learned to Sprint, where I argue that the way social unrest could be handled in the future is to treat social cohesion as a form of infrastructure that AI itself can help to mold. But some people find that overly, perhaps, authoritarian as a framing. So it's easier to just say, reference other points. Very quickly, because these are such wonderful questions. 7. If everyone becomes an entrepreneur, who would we sell to and why? I think, again, if you analogize entrepreneurship to social media, that's like asking if everyone can publish their own essays, for example. Who would read them? Yeah, who's going to read it? And the answer is people who want to. And of course, there's demand for peer-to-peer publication. 8, wouldn't UBI destroy people's personal motivation to achieve in society? I think UBS, Universal Basic Services, is probably more promising, but the point in UBI is the B. It's basic. So there will always be things and inequalities to hand-wring over and to strive for. 9, how can individuals compete with large players that can afford $1,000 a day on APIs, which I assume is a coded reference to Dave. It may or may not be the case, but I think it sounds like one.
It definitely is. It definitely is.
And so I would say call it the China pattern, which is when you're compute limited, be creative, be more resource efficient, and develop leapfrog approaches that make better use of the compute resources that you have, and also work on problems that are higher leverage given limited compute. 10. And finally, will our patent and trademark offices collapse under the volume of AI-generated entrepreneurship? For the record, I disagree with that point. I would also point out that the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office also has AI.
Of course.
It's not like there's some fundamental asymmetry here. I think it's a little bit. Just quick point on that. I think it's a little bit analogous to saying life can't possibly exist at the bottom of the ocean because the pressure is too great. But what actually happens is the pressure inside the organism matches the pressure on the outside. Similarly, we forget patent litigators are going to have AIs as well, and the patent office will have AIs. Everyone's going to have AI.